Earlier, you heard me say when we were talking about racial relations between the Europeans and some of these places they colonized, we mentioned India and Java. And one of the things I said was that while there was racism, it was not as intense as it will become later on. Well, in the late 1800s, remember women had come in and there was a greater separation between the races. But there's something else that takes off during this time. And the idea in the late 1800s amongst Europeans was that they were racially and genetically inherently superior to other groups, that they were somehow inherently genetically racially superior to other groups. And so we see a ranking of races and putting whites on top. This is Darwinism gone all wrong. It's an idea called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism says this idea of one group being naturally selected to be in charge or to be wherever, that natural selection had chosen the Europeans as the superior race. And they took Darwin's idea and applied it to social groups, ethnic groups, and they said some groups are naturally superior. And they took, and this is a racial profiling from this time period, and I'm going to have you guys read some stories in class and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But we've got this right here. We've got the guy with the Greek, and here's supposed to be the Greek skull, Negro skull. Notice the slanted back forehead and out. And they even, I don't know if you can catch the implication of this, but here's a young chimpanzee. Doesn't look anything like a chimpanzee. But this is how they drew the skull. The idea here was to show how the chimpanzee skull was actually closer to the Greek skull than the Negro skull. Of course, we know that is patently false. It's absolutely wrong, but it gave them a feeling of superiority and therefore justified their ability to control other racial groups. Number two, differences between ruler and those ruled is inherent. It's in their nature. It's just part of who they are, and it can't help but be that way. So, what's the point in interacting with these lesser groups if you really can't change them? Remember I mentioned Africa and the lack of education. What's the point of educating people if, you can't change them? They're just inherently dumb. And I'm sorry to say that, but that was the attitude of this time. Okay? So it gives people, and so racism picks up in the late 1800s and becomes more entrenched and more intensified than it had been earlier. All right. In what ways were tropical dependencies subjugated? Subjugated means to be kept in a lower position. Economically, they're subjugated in the following ways. Again, this should sound familiar to us. It should sound like core dependent relations. Finished goods sold from Europeans to locals. Local economies don't benefit from the entire process. What do local economies supply? Under core dependent, remember you did it on a test earlier? That's right. Dependent nations provide raw materials. And so these dependent nations exist solely for the purpose of making Europeans able to buy cheap, cool stuff. Okay? So they are being left out. Now, it's not going to take them long to be angry about that. And you'll learn about that in the next time period, 1914 on. Okay? What about a couple of places that are special and unique, a little different? South Africa is one of those places. So my first question is describe the history of the Boer states. Okay, Orange Free State and Transvaal. You'll see them labeled right up here on the map. See Orange Free State and Transvaal. They were allowed, the Boers, see, all right, let me back up and tell you a little bit of the history. Cape of Good Hope down here in Cape Town. This is where the Dutch first settle. But the British win this from the Dutch and take control about 1800. So as the British move in, they are initially a lot more tolerant of Africans than the Dutch descendants. Dutch descendants hate the British for this and move inland, and they move into places here, Orange Free State, Transvaal, even up in here into what will be known here as Rhodesia, which becomes a British colony. Um, they're basically allowed to run themselves in these areas until diamonds were discovered in 1867. Now the British are very interested in these places. Originally it was like, it's not great farmland, it's pasture land. Let them be, let them do. So there's a war here in 1881, and the Boers actually win the initial war. But then the British move in when gold is discovered just 4 years later in 1885. Now these places have diamonds and gold. That's just too much. They got to control these places now. So it results in an all-out Boer war from 1899 through 1902, and that's who would control access to these gold and diamond mines. The British eventually win, but they feel guilty for treating the Boers like garbage. For example, we often think of concentration camps and those kind of things. We associate them mostly with Germany in World War II and later with the Soviets and under Stalin. The first modern concentration camps are actually done by the British during the Boer Wars. So they feel guilty. And what that'll mean for the black Africans is it means they're going to get the shaft. They're going to feel guilty, so they're going to give in to the Boers on a lot of their ethnically racial hatred and laws. You'll see that more in the next time period. All right, what about what's going on in the Pacific? The Pacific tragedies are this time. Remember, we've just finished reading the other one-third of the globe, and there were similarities between New Zealand and Hawaii, who are both out here and fall victim to this, are part of oceanic history. Number one, demographic disasters and social disruptions, similar to first European contacts in the Americas. These people lived isolated for thousands of years, had no immunities to their new diseases, because remember, farming doesn't come along till really, about 3,000 years ago, and they haven't had contact with them. They're vulnerable to outside influences, these new religions, sexual behaviors, weapons, cheap goods. It just decimates Oceania culture. It led to social disintegration and widespread suffering. Agents of these changes, remember reading in the other one-third of the globe, are people like whalers, merchants, missionaries, and the administrators. Both New Zealand and Hawaii have large native populations. Before the Europeans arrived, there are perhaps millions of people in Hawaii and millions of people in New Zealand. The solution is to accommodate the British and combine some of the old practices with their new Christianity they bring. And lately, if you look at, and it was in the other one-third of the globe, lately over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a revival in both New Zealand and Hawaii to try to bring back their old cultures. Okay, one more slide, and then we're done with chapter 24 notes. All right, what are the global connections during this time period? In other words, what are the things that connect Europe with the rest of the world? Number one is the Industrial Revolution. It gave motives and the means, that means the ability, and the means, the ability for taking over Asia and Africa. The Industrial Revolution allows better communication, commercial and transportation networks are key, and it existed to support Europe. So the colonies exist to support Europe and its Industrial Revolution. Europeans believe it is their God-given right to dominate these people. Initially, they'll put down revolts with violence, but some of these locals who are trained by the Westerners, Western-trained locals, become leaders of the future revolts because they will become nationalists. In other words, they're going to say, we support our identity as Indians or as Kenyans or wherever they may be in the world. And they will become nationalistic, much like the Europeans have. All right, thank you for listening to Chapter 24. I'll see you guys in class.